Hello everybody. So recently I've been doing some live streams of the Elder Scrolls Online as well as Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. And out of these live streams, people have been asking questions and they've been doing comparisons on their own. And when I throw out words like Sandbox and Themepark, they don't really understand what I'm getting at. When I use World of Warcraft as an example, they don't really know what kind of MMOs predated WoW. There are a lot of people that are under the assumption that WoW and EverQuest style MMOs are pretty much all that MMOs are. So I thought I'd cover the differences between Themepark and Sandbox, going from the first Elder Scrolls game through all the single-player games up to Elder Scrolls Online, and then addressing that one. The Elder Scrolls series, specifically the main titled series, that is, games 1 through 5, they are all of a sandbox nature. Now, they all have a very relevant main quest that can be completed at the player's leisure. However, it's never really the primary focus of those games. The primary focus of those games has always been the world itself, the sandbox. If you want to look into that a little bit more, I've got a video titled What's in a Main Quest. I'll have that linked in a pinned comment. You can go check that out. But for now, we're going to compare the sandbox to something else in order to give the sandbox meaning. In this case, we'll have two examples. In single-player games, we have linear experiences, and in MMORPGs, we have theme parks. These both stand in sharp contrast to the concept of the sandbox. Now, for a single-player linear experience, you'd have something like Super Mario Bros. Or Half-Life. These are scripted, guided experiences, where there's really only one way to the destination. I'm not saying they're bad. In fact, I mentioned those two because they were close to the top of my list of favorite experiences from my earlier days of gaming. But instead of just saying the Elder Scrolls and contrasting those as a sandbox, let's say Minecraft. I think Minecraft would be an excellent example of a sandbox. It's simple and straightforward. You're placed into a world and you can do whatever you want in it. There are resources for you to gather, enemies to overcome, locations to discover, and there's no guiding force whatsoever. There is an underlying progression system, as certain tool types are required to mine higher level resources. But that's all secondary. Everything about Minecraft screams, do what you want, when you want. When somebody tells you a story of something that happened to them in Minecraft, that's their story. Because when you get into Minecraft, you're probably going to have a radically different experience than them. The reason I picked Minecraft is because of the huge differences between it and the Elder Scrolls. Even though they share the category of sandbox, their conventions are very different. Minecraft can be thought of as a rather unforgiving game to new players. The players spawn in, they wander around until night, and they're promptly killed right after hearing a hiss. Minecraft gave them that game day to do whatever they wanted. If they wanted to immediately gather resources and build a shelter, they could do that. But more than likely, a new player who knows nothing about the world is just going to run around until they get killed. But it's the time that's important. The player is given time before nightfall. In Elder Scrolls 1 The Arena, you're in a jail cell. The game also gives you time to orient yourself with the game controls by forcing you to go pick up a key, go to the door, and unlock it. This is a subtle test to ensure the player is ready to complete all the challenges expected of them in the intro dungeon. After exiting the jail cell, there are goblins directly to the right and other monsters all over the place. The game has begun. That first dungeon is going to weed out a good chunk of players who cannot grasp the combat controls or how to navigate the game, just like the first night of Minecraft is going to weed out many players who just can't adapt to the day-night cycle. I'm not saying players will outright quit. Many will see this setback as an opportunity to do it right next time. This method that players learn by failing wasn't just core to sandbox games. It was a core tenet of early gaming in general, one that used to be taken to various extremes in different games. Sections of games like the Battletoads Turbo Tunnel became infamous, using difficulty to pad out the length of a game. However, regardless of how extreme the learning curve was, it's clear that a lot of games simply did not give you a free pass. You'll notice, though, that where Minecraft granted you a sandbox right away, giving you time to learn its systems, Elder Scrolls 1 actually put you into a linear dungeon to give you time to acclimate to the systems. That's right, it was linear in the beginning, and it became a sandbox later. Once you exit the dungeon, you're dropped into your home province. So Dark Elves would start in Morrowind, Khajiits would start in Elsewhere, High Elves would start in the Somerset Isles, and so on. From that point on, the game was a sandbox. Of course, there was a linear path you could go to complete the main quest, but as I mentioned earlier, the main quest was able to be finished at your leisure, and until you did all of that, Tamriel was yours to explore. This convention would continue into Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, where the player was offered a series of tutorial menus prior to being put into the starting dungeon. And again, the player was expected to navigate out of the starting dungeon. This one far less forgiving than Arena, but again, requires you to move, open doors, fight enemies, and work your way out to the surface. Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind would start to streamline the process, skipping the open dungeon entirely, allowing you to start exploring right after you exited the census office when you're creating your character. This caused a good chunk of players to get lost right off the bat, which was a bad thing, because many of these players simply gave up, not knowing where to go or what to do or how to get back to where they started. But this is a truer sandbox in the vein of Minecraft, where you weren't given an intensive training session. You were just plopped down and left to figure it out for yourself. The sheer number of people who die trying to hit a rat or a mud crab outside town was staggering. So it wasn't really unexpected that starting in Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, they put you back into a starter dungeon. Now, the starter dungeon in Oblivion was not nearly as brutal as the starter dungeon in Daggerfall, and the tutorials in it were a lot more subtle. There was both heavy and light armor laying around. There was a couple weapon types open to the player. So it was possible that a player could run past all of these opportunities to learn and go right to witnessing the Emperor's death. But a more exploring player, someone who checks all the corpses, someone who looks inside the treasure chests, they will find everything they need to support every play style that Oblivion had to offer. Now, the game became a sandbox once the player exited the Imperial sewers. Oddly enough, after this training session, which was the Imperial sewers, the game gave the player one more chance to change any of their starting attributes, race, class, skills, things like that, just in case they found their trial run in the sewers to be suboptimal. It was a fair and forgiving concept, and then off to the sandbox. Now, Skyrim was the cinematic game in the Elder Scrolls series, where they stopped telling you about events and started putting you into the thick of things. Helgen Keep is attacked by a dragon and you have to survive. You run through the keep, and the inside of the keep is another example of a subtle tutorial, as they require you to open doors, pull switches, and fight NPCs. They give you multiple chances to loot light and heavy armor, as well as various weapon types, the ability to use lockpicks, and learn a spell from a spellbook. There are potions to pick up in Helgen Keep. In short, the game actually gave you a guided tour to all its features right in that opening dungeon. But just like in Oblivion, you could run past all those opportunities to learn and go right for the end. And although Skyrim does give you a tour guide in order to get you to Riverwood, should you avail yourself of that, it's not mandatory. Once you step outside of Helgen Keep, you're free to explore the sandbox. As you can see, linear elements can be applied to the sandbox, but it doesn't strictly rule out the game being a sandbox overall. In a sandbox game, you can still have quests and guided experiences, but ultimately the order in which these events play out, as well as the success or the failure of those events, is entirely up to the player. So we've established here that the Elder Scrolls series in its entirety has a linear quest built into the overall sandbox. And the sandbox is what allows the Elder Scrolls worlds to feel so unique and so fun. Because anyone who's played these games to any extent knows if you just power through the main quest, ignore all side quests, ignore all other things, you're missing out on most of the game. Now, MMORPGs were relatively the same as well. We had games like Ultima Online, Star Wars Galaxies, Asheron's Call, all of these different games, which were sandboxes. There's even a sandbox that still runs today known as EVE Online. But then something happened. To quote another YouTube channel, and I'll have that video linked in a pinned comment, World of Warcraft ruined everything. That's right, World of Warcraft ruined everything. Even though EverQuest beat them to the punch in terms of creating a Themepark MMORPG, World of Warcraft was so massively successful that every other company looking to run an MMORPG abandoned the idea that their MMO should have 10,000 or 100,000 players. If their MMORPG wasn't making millions of players, it was a commercial failure from the investor's perspective, because why settle for small fries when we could copy World of Warcraft and do it better and make all the money? And that is how World of Warcraft ruined everything. And now MMORPGs follow the theme park method. The best way to explain this sandbox versus theme park structure is to compare Star Wars Galaxies to the Old Republic Online. They're both Star Wars MMORPGs, but they're made in the pre- and post-World of Warcraft eras. Now, before anyone thinks I'm evangelizing Star Wars Galaxies, you have to understand the game was a piece of crap. It had one of the worst combat systems ever made for an MMORPG. But the underlying foundations of the skill systems, the crafting systems, the class systems, the reliance on buffs and communities, the fact that players built and owned towns and places. This allowed for unique politics and situations to occur entirely based on the player base. Something that simply can't happen in the Old Republic Online. In the Old Republic Online, you have an extremely well-crafted single-player experience injected into a massively multiplayer game. The reality is that the Old Republic Online is a single-player game, but it has a segmented multiplayer element which doesn't actually need to be there for the game to continue functioning. As we've seen with newer expansion packs, such as Knights of the Fallen Empire and Knights of the Eternal Throne, amazing expansions that pretty much bring Mass Effect levels of epicness into Star Wars. There's still no place in any of that for the multiplayer to shine. Now, Star Wars Galaxies did not fail because it was a sandbox. Star Wars Galaxies failed because of incompetent decisions on the developer's part that caused people to leave the game en masse because the game, quite frankly, wasn't getting the kind of support it should have, and what the developers thought players should like, they were forcing on the players without consulting the players beforehand. In an MMORPG, without doing any kind of focus testing, that is fatal to your game, and they found that out very quickly as they started to transition Star Wars Galaxies from a sandbox to a theme park, where they wanted to empower the players and give them instant gratification. You see, whereas Star Wars Galaxies, you were fourth rebel trooper to the left, or you were a dancer or a shipwright or whatever person that existed in the Star Wars universe, they started making the transition to power fantasy. And in doing so, they destroyed their game. And then it was swiftly replaced with the Old Republic Online, where you are the focus of the game world. It has fully transitioned from a sandbox to a theme park, because the Old Republic takes place in a post-World of Warcraft world where it's, simply put, too risky to make anything that isn't like WoW, that isn't also a theme park. Now, I'm not saying we should leave everything up to the players and just have a world with no content. No. We've seen No Man's Sky and what kind of world is created when there is absolutely no developer guidance whatsoever. Obviously, you need to establish the framework and you need to guide players into the natural decisions that would lead them to have meaningful interactions with one another in this sandbox world. Again, if you haven't already seen the video, World of Warcraft Ruins Everything, go check that out because they go into detail about EVE Online, really the only successful sandbox MMO still running to this day. It has two major alliances in it. Originally, it was just Band of Brothers, and then the Something Awful forums invaded. The Something Awful forums became known as Goon Swarm. Goon Swarm and Band of Brothers fought and had this amazing climactic war, which cost thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of damage to in-game assets. Now, I could spend all day explaining how EVE Online's economy works and how awesome and scary it is. But instead, I'm just going to say that none of those events were engineered by the developers of the game. All of it happened organically as a result of players interacting with other players. That is the brilliance of a good sandbox. And it's those kind of events that players wanted when they originally heard about the World of Warcraft. Because remember, before WoW came out, there were still many sandbox games to go through. And so we all had our own ideas, our own expectations about what we'd be able to do. And there were many organic elements in World of Warcraft's open world PvP system at the time, before it got segmented and regimented into these small battlegrounds, where the only way to get the honor points was to do the battlegrounds. Now, world PvP is still possible in the game, but it isn't rewarding to do. In fact, it's highly discouraged. So the question most people probably have at this point is, how does this fit into the Elder Scrolls Online? Well, the Elder Scrolls Online is, in the World of Warcraft fashion, a theme park MMO. And before you say, well, it actually has a sandbox in it known as Cyrodiil, where players fight each other, it's not a sandbox. That is merely just a battleground on a scope and scale much larger than you would typically see in an MMORPG. It's still divided from the rest of the game and has no real impact other than to give you some gold and some gear and things like that. To most players who don't do trials or veteran dungeons, this is seen as the true end game to dominate Cyrodiil. And how one goes about taking over keeps is pretty much the same every time. Go to the enemy's keep with a battering ram, ballistas, trebuchets, and catapults. Take down the enemy door or walls, depending on which way you want to come in. Get to the inside of the keep, take the flag, and dominate the keep. There's also a capture the flag mode built in. You see, each faction has 2 Elder Scroll temples, and you can run your character into the Elder Scroll temple, steal the Elder Scroll, and run it to one of your forts where it'll be protected. Your faction gains an Elder Scroll bonus for owning enemy Elder Scrolls. The bonus is minor, like plus 5% to damage dealt, plus 5% armor bonus, so on and so forth. So the procedure itself is identical every single time. It is a well-crafted and balanced experience that is not organic in any way. However, there is something about Elder Scrolls Online that does pull from the sandboxes, and that is the economy. Elder Scrolls Online has guild vendors. These guild vendors can be located in any city, and every week there's a kind of auction that takes place in order to secure a place in amongst the guild vendors in a major city. These spots can go for millions of gold, but members of this guild can put items up for sale on the guild vendor, and other players can buy those items as if it were an auction house. The goal of putting these up is to not only recoup the fee for having put the vendor there, but also to make a profit on top of that. This has given rise to the formation of trading guilds, whose sole purpose is to buy and sell items. But other than that, from the quests to the dungeons to the trials, all of it is a part and parcel theme park MMO. So when people say I'm unfairly comparing the single-player Elder Scrolls games to the multiplayer game that is Elder Scrolls Online, and that an online MMO has to be this way, that there's no other way it could have been made, I'm sorry, you're flat out wrong. I can only come to the conclusion that these people haven't played enough sandbox MMOs, quality ones, to know what they're talking about when they make these statements. And they're speaking from a place of ignorance where they've only ever experienced the theme park. Now, I'm not saying Elder Scrolls Online is bad. Hell, I have a review of it up on my channel. I'll put that in a pinned comment as well. Overall, I gave it a positive review, although there were parts of it I didn't like. I also did a series, What If Elder Scrolls Online Was Good, which pissed off quite a few fans because, well, I dared to suggest a sandbox alternative to the existing Elder Scrolls Online. Some people liked it, but a lot of people didn't. Because, you know, I kind of insulted their favorite thing. Now, I'm not going to get into, is Elder Scrolls Online canon? I'm not going to get into, is the story well written? I'm not going to get into any of that. I've made my opinions on all of that known in other videos. I'm here strictly to talk about how ZeniMax Online Studios, that's ZOS, rejected the sandbox that all other Elder Scrolls mainstream games used in order to copy World of Warcraft and EverQuest and all the other theme park MMOs. They rejected the sandbox nature of their game series in order to create something that, quite frankly, is at odds with it. It is on the opposite side of the spectrum, and it shows. For all I like Elder Scrolls Online, for all I'm going to live stream Elder Scrolls Online more, you can't deny that ZeniMax Online Studios is a business, and that they made the choice to chase after that theme park money instead of making something that was truer to the main series. Speaking of them being a business, I think I'll tackle that Crown Store next time. But for the rest of you, like or dislike the video, throw a comment on, please. Check the links on screen for more content, and I will see y'all later. That's happening. I was destroyed by a skeleton. Oh shit. Okay, so I've got a death beam there. Oh shit, he's using his axe. Holy shit. Okay. So, what we need to do now... Oh fuck. What the hell? And dead! A ghost killed me. So, utterly murdered.